Welcome to this episode of Out of the Best Books, the podcast where we deep dive into classic literature and have conversations about what we've learned and discovered along the way. We love all things books and reading, and we want to share our love of the classics with you. We hope to inspire you to read along with us and join in the conversation. I'm Amity.
And I'm Laura. Let's get started.
Okay, so today we are going to jump into our first Dickens book that we've covered on our podcast, A Tale of Two Cities. And we talked last week, we kind of gave an introduction talking about Charles Dickens and his books. And the recommendation from some people is not necessarily to start with this one, but who likes to be conventional? Not us. So we're starting with A Tale of Two.
We found out that information after we decided to do this book.
That's true. But also Charles Dickens himself said he felt like this was his best story. And so why not start with the best? It's very good. So today we're going to jump in and we're going to cover book one. Book one is called, he just called the book the first, Recalled to Life. That's sort of an ominous foreshadowing of what's going to happen.
No, that's going to come up a lot. Recalled to life. And this theme of resurrection, and be interesting to see how many times this is mentioned.
Yeah. And that we can tie it into many different parts throughout the entire book. It begins in the year 1775. So chapter one is called The Period. The two cities that we're going to talk about are Paris and London. To start out, the first chapter kind of gives us this whole, it sort of is giving us the setting. So we don't really need to talk about the setting because it's giving it to us. So it's the year 1775, as he says several times. And it probably starts out with one of the best known lines anywhere. You don't have to have necessarily read Charles Dickens to know this line for it to be familiar.
Right.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. But then it goes on. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. And then I love this. So he's giving us all these opposites, and you're kind of as you're reading it, you're kind of going, oh, that's very back and forth, up and down. It's just wow, what a time to live in. But then he gives it to us. He says, in short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. In other words, it's like every other period of time throughout history. Because don't we see that? Any period that you're living in, it could be considered the best of times and the worst of times. It could be considered the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. For the time that you're living in, it is both of those things. How many times do we hear the older generation say things or even us, this, it's near the end because everybody is just awful. Kids these days, they've been saying kids these days forever.
For 200 years.
I don't know how we're going to survive this. And yet we do. We keep on surviving. We think it's going to be the end of the world. And it never is. There's always the best and the worst at the same time. And that's how we keep pulling through. That's how the world keeps on surviving.
Yeah.
So,
I think we look at our times, and it's it's so wonderful and amazing and good. And then also there's so many bad things. But then if you look at any time in history, I keep thinking people will say oh, it's so, the world is so bad. I'm do you know what happened in history? Have you forgotten all that stuff we learned about?
Yeah.
It's it's always like this.
It is always. In fact, my kids and I were studying about the Black Plague, its sort of first appearance in the 14th century, and how it killed like 25 million people. And considering the population of the world at that time, that's devastating. In Europe, it was like 1 in every 3 or something people died of the plague. Like many of the people at that time thought it was the end of the world. And you could see why they would think that. Like it was awful. At the same time, it wasn't the end of the world. And it actually was something that ended the feudal system. It made way for like these changes that were so needed in the world that wouldn't have happened any other way. Like, I don't know. There's opposition in everything.
Yeah.
Super interesting. So it talks about how in England, there was a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face. And in France, there was a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face. It just kind of goes through and talks about different things. Something that I love, though. So this is the year 1775. And it talks about how there's these messages coming from the British subjects in America. Now, this is 1775, so the Declaration of Independence hadn't been submitted yet or anything, but I love how he's like, it's strange to relate that these messages and events coming from America have proved more important to the human race than any communications yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. And like, I could be wrong, but I kind of think that what he's saying there is they really believed that the United States would amount to nothing. Of course, it wasn't the United States yet, but like people in America, those crazy people over there, like they were grumbling, they were complaining, they were making threats, and they really thought it would come to nothing, that it was just like, chicken squawking.
It reminds me of Hamilton and like the king when he's singing about, when King George is singing about, like, he's like, these idiots, like what do they think they're going to do here? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Like when he says, John Adams, good luck. He's back at it,
Yeah. And Dickens is acknowledging, it was kind of world changing what happened over there. It wasn't just nothing. But then France, on the other hand, talks about how it was rolling smoothly downhill. Just there's so much suffering and hunger and want. And he goes into that a lot more later. And he gives a lot of foreshadowing. He talks about the woodman Fate, who basically, he alludes to it like building the guillotine and bringing it to France. And then the farmer Death had already set apart to be his tumbrils of the revolution. Anyway, so he, like I say, he's just setting everything up. Where is England? England is kind of in a place of chaos. Like it's a little better than France, but there's chaos. There's a lot of highwaymen, and it's dangerous on the roads all the time. And they can't really trust anyone. And so that kind of leads us right into chapter 2.
Yeah, we're going to get a lot of that. Chapter 2 is called The Mail. I couldn't believe how much I was able to understand out of this. I didn't think, like when I read chapter 1, I was like, I have no idea. I mean, I did kind of know what was happening because I was able to look stuff up and figure out what they were saying. But anyways, I'm really catching on. So I love it. Dover is a city that's basically halfway between London and France. And it's kind of like where they cross through to go back and forth between the two, right? Yes. Okay. So there's this mail coach with 3 passengers. Now, these 3 passengers are walking next to the coach because the road is in such bad condition that the horses are having a hard time getting up this hill. It's muddy. There's been tons of rain. Nobody trusts anybody.
Yeah.
And this comes up several times in here about how they can't trust anyone. And these 3 passengers inside the coach don't trust each other. And the driver, what do you call him? The driver of the coach?
There's the driver and the guard.
Yes. And they don't trust anybody. And they're just, so 2 other passengers besides the one that we're focusing on, were plodding up the hill by the side of the mail. And they're all wrapped up, completely wrapped up. It's like around their heads, and they have jack boots on. And it says, not one of the three could have said from anything he saw what either of the other two was like. And each was hidden under almost as many wrappers from the eyes of the mind as from the eyes of the body of his two companions. They're so wrapped up in all this gear that they don't even know what anybody else looks like or is doing, and everybody is suspicious of each other. Funny word that I mean, I figured out what it was by the context, but blunderbuss.
It's not such a great
Gone,
word.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, again, it says the guard suspected the passengers suspected one another, and the guard, they all suspected everybody else. And the coachman was sure of nothing but the horses. So the horses are the only ones that he can count on.
Yeah.
So once they get to the top of the hill, the passengers get in.
Yes.
Because when he shows up, they're all inside so they get to the top of the hill, they get in, they're super dirty and muddy. And then they hear a horse coming up behind them. And the guard is ready with his blunderbuss. Mm-hmm. And they talk about all the gear he has next to him that he can grab really fast because they don't trust anybody on this road. This horse is galloping up. He's coming up quickly. And the guard is ready to defend them. And the rider of the horse says, "Is that the Dover mail?" And he says, "Why do you want to know?" "I want a passenger if it is." So the messenger is asking for who the passenger that we're looking at in the mail carriage, which is Mr. Jarvis Lorry. And Mr. Lorry recognizes him pretty quickly, that he's this Mr. Jerry Cruncher from the bank. And he's a guy that kind of does odd jobs for the bank. It's just kind of funny. He has a hoarse voice. And so that's one of the reasons the guard doesn't trust him. This is his hoarse voice. He says, "I don't like Jerry's voice. If it is Jerry, he's hoarser than suits me, is Jerry." Okay. So then he says, "I've been sent by the bank," right? It's like Tellison and Company, mm-hmm. To send a message. And Mr. Lorry says, "I know who this is, so don't worry." So they help him get out of the coach.
Yeah.
And
they
then
basically
really
push him out of the coach.
Yes. And then they really quickly shut the door because they're like, they don't trust, nobody trusts anybody here.
No. And what I love is that Mr. Lorry is like trying to establish some credibility and be like, "Oh, I know who he is. Like, he's from Telson's Bank. It's fine." And the guard is like, "That doesn't mean anything to me."
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. I wrote down,
it doesn't mean that I trust you or him.
Yeah. He's trying to assure them, like, "I know this guy. This is fine. This is, this is not dangerous." Finally, the messenger gives this message: "Wait at Dover for Mamselle," which is, Mr. Lorry understands this message, but he sends back the message, "Recalled to life." And everybody is confused by this message that Mr. Lorry is sending back. They are, it doesn't make any sense to them. So, and I mean, throughout this chapter, there's so many references to like their insecurity with what's going on and like who they can trust, right? With those words. So once he gives back this strange message, and he says to the messenger, "Take that message back and they will know that I received this, as well as if I wrote it back," right? So they're going to understand it. Anyways, he says, with those words, the passenger opened the coach door and got in, not at all assisted by his fellow passengers, who had expeditiously secreted their, is that how you'd say that? Secreted?
I've heard it both. I've heard it both secreted and secreted. So
secreted, that's what I was thinking. Okay. Had expeditiously secreted their watches and purses in their boots and were now making a general pretense of being asleep. So they're pretending that they're sleeping inside the coach when he gets back in.
I know, like, don't make eye contact.
Yes, just the funniest thing. Like, I mean, it is said several times in this chapter that nobody is trusting anybody here. So then as they leave, as the messenger, he kind of turns around and goes back down the hill, back towards the bank. It seems like Jerry is worried about this message that Mr. Lorry gave him, because I think it means that he's going to have to do something that maybe he doesn't want to do. It says, That's a blazing strange message. Much of that wouldn't do for you, Jerry. And he's talking to himself. I
Yeah.
say, Jerry, you'd be in a blazing bad way if recalling to life was to come into fashion, Jerry. So, whatever this message means, I think it means not good things for the messenger.
Yeah.
I hope I did
Something
okay
that,
with that.
yes, yes. The last thing that I wanted to bring out in that though is just this hilarious exchange. We talked about how Dickens like loves to be funny, and he is really funny. Like there's so many things, but this exchange between Tom and Joe, the coachman and the guard. So they're talking about the message that Mr. Lorry sent back with Jerry. And so get this little conversation. Tom, hello, Joe. Did you hear the message? I did, Joe. What did you make of it, Tom? Nothing at all, Joe. That's a coincidence too, for I made the same of it myself. Just like, we're so confused. But it's just like little details like that. You're like, what the heck?
Do you ever say that? Like, I didn't get that. You didn't get that either? Yeah. You know, that's kind of funny. Like, that's
Yeah.
funny. I didn't understand either.
Yeah.
I remember reading that. I
It's
should
really
have
funny.
marked it.
So, okay. So, chapter 3, the night shadows. So, I love what he opens with. He says, every human creature is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other. He talks about even like, so in a house, there's secrets. In rooms in the house, there's secrets. And even in the person next to you, you may think you know them, but they still have secrets.
I read that that's what he does in the beginning there. That first little sentence is called an authorial intrusion. That
Okay.
he's talking to us.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
And that's something that Thomas Hardy did a lot.
Yes.
Too. In
I
the
noticed
beginnings
that.
of his chapters, he would often like impart these observations and bits of wisdom. So,
Yeah, that we can't know everything about anybody. Like,
no,
even the people
not
that are
at
very
all.
close to you, there's secrets and things you don't know about them.
In talking about that, like he goes deeper into it, but then really he's talking about how the 3 passengers are in this little tiny carriage going for hours together, but they don't know each other at all. Jerry, the messenger, he's going back to where he started from, and it just talks about how he stops at these ale houses along the way, and he's kind of like giving him these little pep talks all the way along. He keeps talking to himself. No, Jerry, no, it wouldn't do for you, Jerry. Jerry, you honest tradesman, it wouldn't suit your line of business. Anyways, it's really funny. And then this part I really love. It says that several times he would take off his hat to scratch his head. Except on the crown, which was raggedly bald, he had stiff black hair. And it was so like Smith's work, so much more like the top of a strongly spiked wall than so it was like it's basically like iron. Like it's so stiff he can't really even scratch his head.
Can't get to his head.
Yeah, and like again, like one of those details that are just so funny.
Yeah, and it was the best players at Leapfrog might have declined him as the most dangerous man in the world to go over.
I love that. It's so funny. His hair is a weapon. It will skewer you if you try to jump over his head.
Well, yeah, because he's wondering, he's like thinking and scratching his head, like, what does that message mean? And he even says he must have been drinking to give me this message. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
So he's going back to Tellson's bank to deliver the message. And it just talks about how there's all these shadows along the way, and it makes the mayor very nervous. Well, the mail coach is going along its way as well. And what's going on as the mail coach is, it kind of like circles it back because it talks about how everybody has secrets. We can't possibly know each other and completely. And there's these 3 passengers all together, and they don't know what's going on in the head of of Mr. Lorry, who's like holding on to the strap of the coach, and it's going along. And of course it's like jingling and making lots of noise and all these things, but he keeps dozing off. And every time he dozes off, the sounds that are part of the carriage ride become something in the bank. His life is in the bank. And so he's dreaming, and everything in the real world around him becomes part of his dream worlds. And he's always at the bank doing something. But then part of his dream, he must fall a little bit further asleep, because it says he was on his way to dig someone out of a grave. Okay, he sees all these faces in front of him, and then they kind of come together to be one face. The face was in the main one face, and every head was prematurely white. And he talks about a man who is 5 and 40, so 45 years old. And because he sees all these faces, but they're really all the face of one man. And that's why it all comes together to be this one person, somebody who's 45 years old. Now, what I'm not sure of is it's probably the age the man was the last time he saw him, because this is a real person. It's somebody that he knows. So he has a conversation with the specter. He says, "Buried how long?" The answer was always the same: "Almost 18 years. You had abandoned all hope of being dug out long ago. You know that you are recalled to life." There it is. There's that phrase, recalled to life. Like, come back. "They tell me so. I hope you care to live." "I can't say." "Shall I show her to you? Will you come and see her?" So this is an extremely enigmatic conversation. We've read further on, so it becomes clear what it all means, and that's wonderful. But at this point in the book, it's like, what is even happening right now?
Who is she?
Who is she?
Yeah.
And the specter says, I don't want to see her too soon. And then he's like, "Well, take me to her." So he keeps having this recurring dream of having this conversation with the specter, of digging him out of a grave. So finally the sun rises. He wakes up completely. But as he wakes up and looks out at the sun, he's like, his dream has stayed with him, because obviously his dream is just echoing reality. And he says, 18 years, gracious creator of day, to be buried alive for 18 years. And of course, what we're going to find out is this person, who is a real person, was not buried alive for 18 years. He was in prison for 18 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I love that. The funny thing, I think, is when he's like waking up. Well, okay, so every time he kind of wakes up, he's trying to kind of get himself into reality. And so he like opens up the coach to get some air, and the passengers get mad at him every time he does that.
Oh, yes.
Like he wakes up and he's like, okay, these are weird dreams that I'm having. I've got to like snap myself back out of this, right? But then everybody in the coach is like, no. So in our car, okay, I don't know if this happens to you, but like if one of the windows in the car is down, and it's not my window, say if like one of the back windows is down, it like does something to my ears. Like I don't like the pressure or whatever. And so in the car, I'm always like, roll up your windows. And if nobody I can't handle any of the windows being down. So
no, like when you're driving on the freeway, especially if just the back windows are down, like it's awful.
Yes.
It's awful.
And
I don't know if they can feel that in the back.
Well, if it's their window, they don't feel it.
They probably can't.
But like, I'm like, all of a sudden my head is going, and I'm like,
totally.
It just reminded me of that he's like trying to like center himself, and they're like, roll up the window. Yeah. And then we get this idea that like he's gonna dig. I mean, he's not really gonna. I mean, maybe he does dig somebody up out of a grave, but that he's gonna do this, right? Yeah. After such imaginary discourse, the passenger in his fancy would dig and dig, now with a spade, now with a great key, now with his hands, to dig this wretched creature out.
Yeah. He'll do everything he can to get him out.
Yep. Yeah. And it says the passenger would then start to himself and lower the window to get the reality of mist and rain on his chest, on his cheek. And so then they would like freak out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna have to look to do better about seeing the humor in this, I guess, because you're good at this. But anyways, so let me know if I'm missing the humorous parts. Okay, so chapter 4, the preparation. Okay, so they get to Dover. So they're going to this hotel, the Royal George Hotel. So he's the only one left in the coach. The other two had been dropped off at their destinations. The mildewy inside of the coach, with its damp and dirty straw, its disagreeable smell, and its obscurity, was rather like a larger dog kennel. Mr. Lorry, the passenger, shaking himself out of it in chains of straw, a tangle of shaggy wrapper, flapping hat, and muddy legs, was rather like a larger sort of dog. Like, ew. The coach smelled bad. They were dirty. They smelled bad.
Yeah.
Ugh. Thought that was kind of funny. So he goes to breakfast. He gets put in the Concord room, which is set aside for these male coaches. And this was funny. They go in looking like one thing and they come out looking like something else, because when they get there, they're wrapped up in all this stuff, right? Yeah. Heavily wrapped up from head to foot. And then they don't know, all kinds of varieties of men come out of this room the next morning or whatever.
Yeah. I love it.
Really funny. Okay. So Lori's job is that he's like a secret agent for the bank. So he uses this cover of business to help with like political things. So he tells them he's eating breakfast, right? It kind of tells us that about him being a secret agent. And then he orders a room for Lucy, who is the person that he's meeting at the hotel.
Yes.
And they say to him, "You're not really a traveler. Like, you haven't traveled in a long time, have you?" And he says, "No, it's been 15 years since we," and then he corrects himself, "since I came last from France." I mean, later we'll find out that we is him and Lucy.
Mm-hmm.
He finishes his breakfast and I think he goes on a little walk by the sea. Dickens has this like nice little, I really am enjoying his like descriptions of things, like the sea and how
you can really
like,
see it and even smell it. I love it how it's like the air among the houses was of so strong a piscatory flavor that one might have supposed sick fish went up to be dipped in it. So it just smells very fishy.
It's like going to Newport.
Yes.
Then it becomes, I mean, he's just kind of there waiting for her, right? A waiter comes and says that she has arrived from London and wants to see him. And he's that's funny. So soon? Like, isn't he there waiting for her?
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah. And so, well, maybe because then it says that she had taken some refreshment on the road. And so maybe he's like, well, doesn't she want to rest? Like, why is she coming to see me so soon?
Yeah.
Right.
But it's like, she's fine. She's ready.
Yeah. She wants to know what's going on because she had gotten a letter or a notice saying that there was some property for her that she's going to find out a mystery, right? Like, she wants to know what's going on. I'm like that, right? Like, if something is coming up and I'm going to find out in a couple of days, like, I cannot wait to figure out what's going on. And my husband's just like, whatever. Like, he's fine waiting forever. And I'm always like, I need to know right now. When she comes in to him and he sees her, he remembers 15 years ago, he had brought her there as a 2-year-old because her mother had died and her father, well, I guess we'll figure out what happened to his father. But he says, as his eyes rested on these things, a sudden vivid likeness passed before him of a child whom he had held in his arms on the passage across that very channel, one cold time when the hail drifted heavily and the sea ran high. There's a lot of this in this book I've noticed so far, even in the first 6 chapters, where it's like, oh, there was a time that I had this little child. And then it's like, yeah, and it's her. It's just kind of funny how they do that a lot where they're alluding to something and they're like, it's totally tied in to anyways, what they're doing. So yeah, Lucy had gotten a letter telling her to meet him about property from her, quote, long dead father. She curtsies to him. She's going to France, right? you might have to help me out here. So
Okay.
she has this note. I believe she's supposed to go to France, and she says, I'm an orphan. I don't have anybody to go with me.
Yes. And she's a young lady, and young ladies should not travel by themselves. So,
and that's why he got the message.
yeah.
Because she wants an escort. And so he's the one that's going to take her. Okay.
Right.
And he says, I'm happy to do it, basically. Like, I'm happy you asked me and I want to do it. She says, it was told me by the bank that the gentleman would explain to me the details of the business and that I must prepare myself to find them of a surprising nature. So they're like,
Just a little bit.
Yeah, like you're going to be shocked. So maybe that's why she went so fast. He basically tells her about a story. So this is what I was just talking about. He tells her a story about one of his customers from 20 years ago named.
Well, it's kind of funny because he says he was a French gentleman, a scientific gentleman, a man of great acquirements, a doctor. She's like, was he from Beauvais? Yes, he was a Beauvais, like Monsieur Manette, your father.
Yeah. It might be him. Yes.
Like Monsieur Manette, your father, the gentleman was of repute in Paris. Like he was well known. He was well respected. And again, he was one of the customers of the bank.
Yeah. And he says, I was like, I knew him through business relations. He's like, I wasn't really his friend. And he knew him 20 years ago. And he married an English lady. And he was one of the bank trustees for them. She then says that she remembers him bringing her when her mom died.
Yes.
Taking her to, tell me again, he takes her to France, right?
He takes her to England.
And then they're going to go.
They leave.
Yeah.
Oh they leave France when she's.
This is going to hurt my brain.
When she's 2 years old, he takes her from France to England. And what's interesting too is that he keeps saying, this is one of our customers. This is something we do for our business. Our relations were just business relations. These are mere business relations. There's no friendship, no particular sentiment.
Yeah, I think he's lying.
Totally lying. Like people don't do things like that just as a matter of business. So, but he's trying to
he later and throughout this, he's going to bring up, this is just a business matter. This is just a business matter. And it's like him trying to take out his emotions and then trying to help her remove her emotions from the situation. So like this I didn't catch that when I was reading this the first time, but now that I've read so much, you're right. He was totally lying. They were friends. So basically what had happened is Dr. Manette had disappeared and had been taken by the authorities and put in a secret prison. And his wife was trying to get him out, like desperately trying to get him out, going to the authorities, trying to free him. And it didn't work. And so she just decided to tell Lucy that he died. And then at 2 years old, she dies. And so now she's an orphan and nobody knows that her father's still alive because her mother was the one that knew and now she's gone. But yeah, here's where he keeps saying, it's just a matter of business. It's just a matter of business.
Yes. Yeah.
And she kind of freaks out. I mean, she's like having a hard time with this information, right? And I love it when he's like, he checks her clear-headedness.
He's like, okay, let's bring things back for a minute. What's 9 times 9?
Yeah, what's 9 times 9? How many? And he's asking her math problems, right? And he says, I should be so much more at ease about your state of mind if I knew you could answer these questions. What's funny is we spent a day with my mom at the hospital a couple weeks ago where she had this thing called global transient amnesia. And it's something that happens to people, like they lose the ability to make new memories for like 24 hours. And they don't know why it happens. And it's not dangerous. It comes back, but it's very scary when it happens because we're like, what the heck is wrong with you?
Yeah.
And seriously. So we spent the day answering, I have to ask my mom if I can leave this in, answering the same questions over and over and over again. Why we were here, who brought her here, blah, blah, blah. Right. It was hilarious. And she kept every time we go through this loop, she would tell us the same joke. So it was
That
like,
is
it was so funny. Yeah.
that's so amazing though.
Yeah.
Wow.
She would say, we'd say, well, you were confused. And so we brought you to the hospital. And she was like, more confused than usual every time. And then she would say, well, I guess I still am confused. Yes. Then we'd start it all over again. And what's really funny is my sister Emily moved like an hour away from them. So my parents and my sisters live on the same property, and
Mm.
my sister, one of my sisters moved an hour away.
Okay.
And my mom didn't remember that because it happened recently, like in the last few months. And she cried all day about it. Like every time it came up, she would cry. And we're like, you didn't cry when it actually happened. It's very fun.
That is
So
so
I
funny.
guess
She was crying on the inside. when
she
it happened
was,
again.
and she admitted it later. She was like, oh, no, I was really sad, but like, I didn't let you guys know. But it was funny because like he's checking her brain, her cognition, right? And we also, like the doctors, I heard the same questions all day long.
Yeah.
Like, what year is it? Who's the president?
Yes.
That's very funny.
Interesting.
Yeah. Her mother told her that her father was dead. And unfortunately, there's no due discovery of money or any of their property. How disappointing is this? That
Yeah.
wasn't really what was going on. But he tells her, but your father's alive and he's staying with a former servant. But he's not the same. Like,
Yeah.
He's changed. And so his plan is for both of them to go kind of rescue him, right? Oh, and the other thing is he's using a different name.
Yeah.
So this is like, I feel like this is like their secret mission. Like,
Yeah.
she needs to know that, it's a secret. He's using a different name. They have to be discreet. They're going to go rescue him. And then at the end, like, I think she faints, doesn't she? But her, like, her servant comes in and yells at Lori because he should have broke it to her easier.
Yes. And I love this exchange because it talks about this monster of a lady coming in. She's wearing red. She has red hair, just huge, and lays a brawny hand on him and like pushes him across the room. And he's like, I really think this must be a man because she's just like big and strong. And is like really angry at him. Like you said, she's like, why did you do it this way, you dork? And like, yeah. And then she's like ordering everybody else around. So
I also read this as like a typical, that's how a servant then would have been. A female servant was big and brawny and
interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of like he just wrote her like he knew.
Yeah.
Servants were usually. Okay. So this is where we find out also that Lucy is the woman from Mr. Lorry's dream when he was in the coach. And he thinks she is the one that can save her father. Next chapter is hilarious.
Yes.
I mean, the beginning of it is quite funny.
It really is. But there's also some pretty dark foreshadowing.
Yes. But it's like this picture.
Yes.
He really paints, like, that's what I'm noticing about Dickens is he really paints a picture.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like every part of it, you can see every part of it. Like, so to make a movie that's not true to the book, like the people studying the book to make the movie just have to be dumb because it's very obvious how he's envisioned everything in this.
Yeah.
Okay. So chapter 5 is the wine shop, and we are now in France. So a large thing of wine has been broken in the street. It rolled off the wagon or whatever, and the hoops burst off, and the wine flew everywhere. Everyone around stops what they're doing and they run to get the wine. Now, it's dropped in the street, right? But this little detail that he gives, which is so funny. He talks about how the street is so uneven. It could like seriously maim or cripple people because it's just wild. Like the cobblestone, I assume it's like cobblestone, but it's so uneven and awful that it could totally damage people. But the positive side of that is that it has all these crevices and nooks and crannies that hold wine, right? So it's not just wine spilled flat on the street. It has found little bowls basically in the road. So these people drop everything they're doing and they go to slurp up the wine. And they do it in all manner of strange ways.
They're cupping it with their hands.
Yeah.
They're slurping it out of the gutters, and they're licking it off the broken glass.
Yeah. And they're even, some of the women like take the kerchiefs off their head and dip it in and then put it in their infants' mouths and like squeeze it out. And then them for themselves as well. Like there's men bent down and, you know, cupping it, put it in their mouths. There's women bending over the man that holding onto their shoulders and doing this. There's a craze over this wine. And it says there's a special companionship in it. Of course, they're like, you look at it and be like, these people are like,
they're wild.
They are wild and desperate animals.
It kind of reminds me of like zombies.
Oh, totally.
Because they're covered in red.
Yeah. Yeah. But here's what's interesting. When the wine was gone and the places where it had been most abundant were raked into a gridiron pattern by fingers. So they're like scraping it out of the ground. These demonstrations ceased as suddenly as they had broken. And then everybody goes back to what they were doing. And when it talks about what they were doing, we find out that there's a man cutting firewood, but there's a woman who is basically like trying to heat her and her children's starved fingers with some hot ashes. So they are very deprived, you know? So we're starting to get a picture of why there's this rush on the wine and what Paris is like, what life is like for these people. Men with bare arms, matted locks, and cadaverous faces. They go back to their work. And then a gloom gathered on the scene that appeared more natural to it than sunshine, because Paris is just gloomy. I don't know if weather-wise it always is, but at that point in time, it was awful. It was an awful place. And then it talks about how the wine was red wine and had stained the ground of the narrow street in the suburb of Saint-Antoine in Paris. And it talks about how later on, or the time was to come when the wine was red and it reminded people of blood stained there on the ground. And it says the time was to come when that wine too, so the wine of blood, would be spilled on the street stones, and when the stain of it would be read upon many there. And it goes on to talk about, like, you know, there's red stains on their faces. Like the women have like these almost tiger stripes on their faces where they had, you know, stuck it there, and where their kerchiefs are on their head. Now there's red all over their head, and the men have it on their arms and their hands and all over their faces. It's just everywhere. And so it really is reminiscent of blood. And again, like a dark foreshadowing of what is to come, not too many years hence. And then it goes into talking about just their awful situation. There's cold, dirt, sickness, ignorance, and want. Nobles of great power, they were the ones who were inflicting this on them. The children had ancient faces and grave voices. It's like their childhoods had been taken from them because all that they could think about was hunger. Hunger is everywhere. Hunger was the inscription on the baker's shelves. Hunger rattled its dry bones among the roasting chestnuts in the turning cylinder. Hunger is just everywhere. And it's so prevalent. He describes it so vividly that it just made me think, like, when people don't have their basic necessities met, when they're not able to fill their bellies, or at least mostly fill their bellies, nothing else matters.
Yeah.
Like they don't care about the goings on of every day. They don't care about, like, school goes by the wayside, work goes by, like all they can think about is food. And the thing is, like, it didn't matter. They were so hungry and there was no help and almost no hope.
I wrote down that like hunger is like a character
It is.
itself. Like, and it's so he's trying to tell us how desperate these people are.
Yeah.
And it explains later why people do what they do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. When people are so desperate, and it comes down to like not being able to feed their children and watching their
Yeah.
children die of hunger, and watching the people in power not care at all, instead of treating these people who love their children, who love each other, and all they want is like to be able to live.
Yeah.
And having these people in power just treat them like they're nothing and they are just like ants to be squashed. Yeah, it does. It leads people to do some crazy things.
I also like
So,
this. Nothing was represented in flourishing condition.
yeah,
I mean, nothing was good except tools and weapons.
yeah,
They were sharp and bright. Um, yeah, the crippling stones of the pavement, their many little reservoirs of mud and water had, oh, I love this, had no footways, but broke off abruptly at the doors. The kennel, so there's like these, water places water can run if it had, like, it didn't rain enough, but if it rained, it would run, but it would run right into their houses.
hmm
So it was
yeah.
like,
There was no dividing. It
yes,
just, yeah,
there's finally water, and
yeah,
now we're flooded.
right. Yes. At the same time, though, that kind of made me think about when I got to go to Italy a few years ago, and you walk down these narrow streets that like no cars can go down or anything. They're very old and they're so charming and I just love it. But at the same time, it's like the street goes right to the front doors, It's like there's the street and then all of a sudden there's just like this little step and there's the door, and that's the front door of their house. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I picture. And so you could totally see, I think those streets in Florence were designed in such a way that they probably wouldn't flood, especially now, but I could definitely see if your streets were in such a way that water would go right into your house. There's no blocking it at all.
Yeah.
So, okay. So then we zero in on this guy who is the owner of the wine shop. So he's a big guy. He's kind of like, well, it's not my fault the wine cask broke, so people need to send me another one. He sees a joker. It says his eyes happened to catch the tall joker writing up his joke. It wasn't a very good joke.
He wrote blood on the wall with the wine.
Right.
So that's like, that wasn't a very good joke. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't funny.
Well, yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, I guess I read that and it didn't totally click with me. So yeah, good job.
1 point for me.
I
You got like 29. But
No, that was good. So it goes on to describe this wine shop keeper. He's bull-necked, a martial looking man of 30. Like, so somebody you don't want to mess with. And by all the descriptions, you're like, holy cow, this is like this huge kind of like burly, terrifying dude. But later on, he does all these things. You're like, oh, you're actually like a really nice guy. But here's what's interesting. We know he's the wine shop keeper. We've described him, but and it says he's a man not desirable to be met, rushing down a narrow path with a gulf on either side, for nothing would turn them on. So basically, there's only room for one of you. He's not going to make room for you. He's just going to knock you over, So, but what's interesting is he is not named first. His wife is named first. And I think that gives us a little clue about how things are going to go the rest of the book, because she plays a major role. And by learning her name, we do learn what his name is, but she's the one that's named first. And her name is Madame Dufarge. And I hope I'm saying that right. That's how I heard it in the audiobook. So I'm hoping that's right.
I feel like they, like, as you said, like she's the way they describe her, how she's always sitting there watching, but not watching. Like she's not to be trusted.
No, she's like super creepy for sure. And yeah, we're going to learn a lot about her later on. But she's a stout woman. She's probably about 30, and that's about how old her husband is. She has a watchful eye that seldom seems to look at anything. So she's one of those people who's seeing everything because you can't say that she's focused on one thing in particular. She's seeing everything.
But nothing.
Yes, she has exactly. So she has a steady face, strong features, and great composure of manner. She did not often make mistakes against herself in any of the reckonings over which she presided. So she's never going to do herself wrong. Doesn't mean she won't do wrong for somebody else, but she's always going to make sure that she's a Karen. Okay. She's a Karen. She is let me talk to your manager lady. She tells her husband to look around the store because there's all these people in their little wine shop and she wants him to check them out.
The funny thing is she tells him with her eyebrows.
Yeah. She doesn't really say much.
Nope.
At all. Yeah.
She coughs.
Yeah.
She coughs and then she lifts her eyebrows. That's it. And she kind of looks at him and it just signals to him like, you need to go check that out.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Funny.
So what we know is that there's like two groups in the wine shop. There's an older gentleman in the corner with a younger girl, and there's a group of three men. And we find out that everyone's name is Jacques. And I think that's so funny. So he goes over and talks to these men. His name is Jacques. Monsieur Dufarge is Jacques. And all these men, their names are Jacques. I don't know why. That's just so funny to me. I'm like, it's sort of like this, like the stereotypical French name at that point.
It's a code name. It's a code name for the revolutionists in France.
Well, look at that.
I know.
Very good. Like later on, he talks about how he only lets men named Jacques do a certain thing, which we'll talk about. But I didn't realize that part.
Yeah, and it's how they keep from getting in trouble.
Okay.
Like taking messages back and forth because they're all named Jacques.
Okay, Jacques. So that is their way of letting each other know who they are. I love that because he purposely like brings up, okay, they exchange their Christian names. How about you, Jacques? Let's talk about Jacques. It is so, Jacques. It's not often, Jacques. They use their Christian names. But each time he talks to a different one of the Jacques, Madame Dufarge does something to try to get his attention and point him towards something. She coughs, she raises her eyebrows, she uses a toothpick. So it is all like messaging, isn't it?
Yep.
Like the whole thing. He introduces them to his wife, Madame Dufarge. Every time, again, she doesn't say anything, she just knits. She just knits. She raises her eyebrows, she coughs, she picks her teeth with a toothpick, and she knits. It's super creepy. So then he sort of shows the men out. Right then we don't know where they go. But then he goes over and talks to this older gentleman and this younger woman, and we find out it is Mr. Lorry and Miss Manette. So it seems like he knows why they're there. And so they go out of the main part of their shop and they start going up these stairs, and it's a long way up there. It's a lot of stairs. And as they're going, they're talking about this man who's up there, and it becomes apparent that this is Miss Manette's father. And he's been there for a long time, all by himself. And they're like, is he alone? Yes, he's always alone, of his own desire, of his own necessity. And basically we find out that they brought him to Monsieur Defarge. Whoever brought him to Monsieur Defarge was like, you need to be very discreet. Don't tell anybody that you have him. And basically for a while, keep him locked away.
Yeah, because he's used to being locked away and he's kind of mad.
Yeah, he's kind of
Like he's,
crazy at this
yeah.
point. Yes,
The
absolutely.
one funny thing though is like, so they go out into the courtyard and it's tons of people and tons of houses, like in this courtyard in this 5-story building, right? With all these people. And it talks about how, is it here or later, that there's human waste
Mm,
and garbage everywhere.
yeah.
It's all on the, like the people just put it on the steps outside their door, and then they even like throw it out the windows. And so as they're walking, um Lucy can barely breathe.
Yes.
Like she's like having a hard time with this
Yeah.
stench.
Well, and it talks about how there's tastes rather than glimpses were caught of the jumbled neighborhood. I know. You're like,
You could taste it.
you can taste it. Yeah.
Ooh.
You couldn't necessarily see the neighborhood, but you could taste it because it was that just disgusting, sickly vapors, as they said.
Ugh.
And it is a long way up. Mr. Laurie has to stop twice to rest. They finally get there. Monsieur Dufage takes out a key and they're like, "You locked him in?" Monsieur Dufage is like, "Well, yes." And it's kind of interesting because he's like, he has lived so long locked up that he would be frightened and tear himself to pieces if his door was left open.
And
Anyway,
Lucy doesn't hear any of this conversation. They say
right.
it like super quiet so that she won't
Yeah.
hear, because she's already very nervous.
Yes. And so Mr. Laurie's like, courage, courage, the worst will be over. It's going to be fine. And so they go right up to the door and they see these 3 gentlemen who had been in the store. They're looking in the little window at the man inside. Monsieur Defarge tells them, "Okay, you guys need to go now," basically. And Mr. Laurie is kind of disturbed. He's like, "Do you make a show of Monsieur Manette?" And Monsieur Defarge is like, "I show him to only a chosen few. I choose them as real men of my name. Jacques is my name, to whom the sight is likely to do good." Right. So it does make even more sense when you say that it's a code name, because there's a reason that they need to see it, that they need to see Monsieur Manette. So then what's kind of interesting is that Monsieur Dufage goes out of his way to make noise at the door. He like scratches the key across the door. He strikes the door a few times.
Seems like it's a routine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just to kind of like alert Monsieur Manette that there are people coming in, to sort of help him mentally prepare, I guess, is kind of what I understand. And so they go in and Miss Manette is quite afraid. And she's like, I'm afraid of my father. But they go in, they close the door, lock it from the inside, and they see that, it's a pretty dark room, a little bit of light coming in. But over by the window, there's a white-haired man sitting on a low bench, stooping forward and very busy. He was making shoes. So
Yes.
that took me a really long time to get through that chapter. But okay, last chapter for this.
Yes, the shoemaker. So now we get to find out why he's making shoes. So they're in the room still, right? Defarge, he asks the man, can I let more light in? He says, I kind of think he's like, yeah, well, he's resigned to the fact that he's not in charge here. He's like, well, yeah, I guess if you're going to let more light in, I'm going to have to get used to it. So sure, let the light in. And so when they let more light in, they can see that he just doesn't look good. He's dressed in like awful clothing. His face is hollow. His beard is ragged.
Yeah, it's very evident that no part of him has seen the sun for a very long time.
Yes. Like his socks are too big. Yeah, he had in a long seclusion from direct light and air. And like all of his clothes, it sounds like all of his clothes are the same color because they've all faded to this color that from being
parchment yellow, I think is what it says.
Yes. Defarge introduces Lori. I always want to read Lori, because the way I write is not very clear, to the shoemaker. And he says, "What's your name?" He asks the man what his name is, and he says 105 North Tower.
Yeah, which is really sad.
I
He
know.
was
And
in
I mean,
that
I don't know if
prison
that's the
for
name
so
is
long.
that the name he's going by? Or is that like just his? I
Well,
mean, I
what I
understand that it was his like prison name, probably.
yes.
I don't know.
And I think at this point, that's all he knows to answer.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
know, like that's been his identity for the past 18 years. Like probably in the prison, nobody called him by his name.
Yeah.
They're just like called him
105.
by, yeah, called him by the cell that he stayed in. And I think it's interesting too. He gives all these clues, Dickens gives all these clues to this man being like basically, you know, very traumatized, very rattled, kind of insane. You know, I don't know if his hearing is actually bad, but he is continually asking them to repeat what they
Yeah.
say. And then it notes that every time before he answers anything, he like looks down to the right,
And then to the
looks
left.
down to the left, and then up. Yeah. Yeah. So he's just, it's almost like he's making sure that the noise is coming not from his sides, but from in front of him or something.
Now that you say that, I'm like, because I thought, well, is he confused? Is he forgetting what they're asking? But you're right. That did say that he didn't know which direction that the sound was coming from. And so that's why he looked from side to side and then up.
Yeah.
Interesting. So then Mr. Lorry asks him if he is a shoemaker by trade. And he's like, no, I learned this here. And it took me a long time to learn it, but now I'm just doing it.
A part of his brain still believes he's in prison because
Yes.
it was in prison that he learned how to make shoes. So he's like, I learned it here. Well, no, you didn't learn it here. You learned it in prison.
Yeah.
But
right. Oh yeah, that would make sense that's why he said that. Like,
yeah.
Because he thinks he's still, that's interesting. Okay. So then they ask him, does he recognize anybody here? Like,
Mm-hmm.
do any of these people look familiar?
Yeah.
And he'll like get these glimpses of maybe I recognize somebody, and then it'll pass and he'll like,
yes,
brain will go somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And then they ask Mr. Lorry if he recognizes the doctor. Like, does he look familiar to you? And he's like, I think I might have seen him for a brief second in there. Like, I got a glimpse of him, but he's so different and he's so old looking and, you know, ragged. So, so then so they're introducing both of them, right? So now it's Lucy's kind of turn, and he says to her, the old man says to her, you're not the jailer's daughter. So yeah, clearly he thinks he's in prison. And she says, no. And then he says, who are you? It says, not trusting the tones of her voice, she sat down on the bench beside him. So she's like, she's having a hard time with this situation. Right. Yeah. And he kind of jumps back when she sits by him, and then she touches him on the arm, and it says a strange thrill struck him when she did so and visibly passed over his frame. He's holding a knife, which I think the two men are like worried about her sitting next to him, but he puts the knife down and then he just stares at her. So she's got this long golden hair. He kind of picks up her hair and looks at it, and it looks familiar to him. Like he's kind of studying her hair. And then he pulls out this necklace kind of thing that he's wearing with like folded paper, and what he has in there is these two really long blonde hairs that they had found on him, like they were wrapped around his fingers or something when he was put in prison, and so they'd found them on him and he kept them with him all the time, and like so that he could pull it out and look at it and feel better about remember her.
Well, we understand that they were the hairs of his wife.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Because he says that she had laid her head upon his shoulder the night that he was summoned out. She had fear of my going, though I had none. And when I was brought to the North Tower, they found these upon my sleeve. You will leave me them? They can never help me escape in the body, though they may in the spirit.
Right.
So he was like, please let me keep them. Obviously, I can't use these to escape, but, you know, they'll just do me some good. So
That's funny. In my mind, I knew that it was his wife, but I just didn't mention that. Okay. So, so he takes the girl's hair into his hand again, and he looks at it and he's like, this is the same, but how can it be? Like, he's like, I'm an old man.
Yeah.
And this can't be her because clearly she's 17. And he says, it can't, I mean, basically he says, it can't be who I think it is.
Yeah.
It just can't be. I wrote down that like he recognizes something about his wife in Lucy.
Oh, yeah.
And she wants to be the replacement for her mother. Like she wants to take care of him, and he offer him a new life with her. And like, this is kind of goes with like Recalled from Life. For Lucy, it's like he has come back from the dead.
Yeah. And for him, for a minute, he feels like his wife has come back from the dead too.
Yeah. So that's kind of like back to that theme. Yeah. She says to him, if you hear in my voice, I don't know that it is so, but I hope it is. If you hear in my voice any resemblance to a voice that once was sweet music in your ears, weep for it, weep for it. If you touch in touching my hair, anything that recalls a beloved head that lay on your breast when you were young and free, weep for it, weep for it. So like, she's just saying, I want to be a replacement for that.
Yeah.
And I love it. She holds him and like rocks him like a mother would rock a child. It's just so sweet. And he seems to like get it, like understand that there's a connection there. Okay. So they basically decide that they want to arrange to take him to Paris, but they're worried. Is he fit? Like, can he go on this journey? And I think, is it her? Somebody says, I think it's better if he goes than if he stays here in this dreadful city. Is that Lucy saying that?
Dufages. He's
Okay.
like, Monsieur Manette is for all reasons best out of France.
Yes.
So, well, yes, and you're right. I believe that it is Lucy that says he's more fit for the journey than to remain in this city. Yeah.
He just didn't say who said it.
Yeah.
It's like, because they're having this conversation, but then Defarge is the next person. So it had to have been Lucy. Okay. And then she says, why don't you leave me in here alone with him? Like, I think I got this. I've got him calm. Everything's good. And they're kind of worried about it. They don't want to leave her alone, but they do also have to go out and make arrangements so that they can get moving. So they do end up leaving him alone with her. So when they're getting ready to take him out, they come in and they kind of wake him up, right? And help him get up. It says, no human intelligence could have read the mysteries of his mind in the scared blank wonder of his face. So he is just like so confused and doesn't know what's going on. And he's like, where are you taking me? I think I'm in, he thinks he's in jail. I think all this time he's like responding really well to his daughter.
Yes.
And she's totally able to calm him. Okay. So the last thing I have here is that he has no recollection of being released from prison, which we know from before, but it just says it again that he thinks he's in prison.
Yes.
So he's kind of
yeah. And even when they're taking him out, he's behaving as if he's being walked out of his North Tower cell. Like he looks around and instead of seeing houses in the courtyard, he's seeing the thick prison walls and all of that. And there was actually nobody about, but Madame Dufarge leaned against the doorpost knitting and saw nothing.
But yet she saw everything.
Oh my gosh. And then the best. So the prisoner got into a coach and his daughter followed him when Mr. Laurie's feet were arrested on the step by his asking miserably for his shoemaking tools and the unfinished shoes. So her father is like, Mr. Laurie is like, let's get all the shoemaking supplies and bring them. And we understand that Madame Dufarge actually does say something. It's not put in quotes. She says that she will go and get the shoes. And she went knitting out of the lamplight through the courtyard. She quickly brought them down and handed them in, and immediately afterwards leaned against the doorpost, knitting, and saw nothing. Oh my gosh.
Although at the end, it does have the same conversation. You go ahead. I want you to tell it because I'm.
Yeah, no, just at the very end, you know, they're in the carriage, they're going along, and Mr. Lorry uses his same phrasing that he does in his dream. He says, "I hope you care to be recalled to life." And the old Mr. Manette says, "I can't say." The end of the first book.
He doesn't know. Well, he doesn't know what's going on.
No. And is this really life? Has he died? Is he still in prison? Like, he really has no idea what's going on.
I'm really relieved that at this point, at least, there was no digging up 18-year past dead men.
Yes.
So far.
No, just digging a man out of prison.
Yeah.
No skeletons. Although he's pretty close to one.
A lot of this reminded me of like A Christmas Carol, like some of the imagery of like the chains, and I don't know, just kind of, I can see the style in it. Very similar
for sure.
Yeah, I'm really surprised. Like, I think this is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's going to be pretty deep and good. Well, I guess we should talk about what we're reading. So,
okay. I just read Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Oh,
have you read it?
No, but I've heard of it.
Zora Neale Hurston. It's pretty short. It's interesting. I'm going to have a hard time explaining it. So I'm probably not going to explain much about it, but because I don't really know. Okay. I hate to explain. I hate to say that.
Okay. So it's just Their Eyes Were Watching God?
No, I'll tell you. Let's see. It's a classic, I guess, apparently.
Yes.
I heard that it was written in 1937. So I wish I had known that when I was listening to it. But it's about a Southern Black woman in the 1930s who, like, she's married to this man that's just awful. And he ends up dying, and then she marries this other man that loves her. What's funny about it is it was hard to get into at first because there's like a dialect in the writing. And so at first, and it's kind of all over the place. So it was like, now what's going on? It's like a lot of, I don't know, it's like a lot of conversation and not a lot of like, there's no telling you what's going on. It's just like people talking, if that makes sense.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, it's just carried on by dialogue. Yes.
And so that it was hard for me to get into, right? And it took me probably halfway through to like kind of grasp what was going on. I got little bits here and there, but like, yeah. And the end, I thought the second half was very good and interesting. And I was like wanting to know what was happening. There's like, yeah, I don't want to say much about it because there's a lot that happens. But what's funny is my grandmother is from Mississippi, from Mississippi. And I did not know that she had an accent growing up. I never recognized it, right? But then when I was about 18, 19 years old, I brought a boy that I was dating. We went up and visited her one day, and all of a sudden I was looking at her through somebody else's eyes. And I was like, oh my gosh, my grandma sounds like a Southern woman. Like, it was really funny. So I wasn't like, I was like 18 or 19 years old when I realized that my grandmother had an accent and sounded like a Southern. I mean.
So like, how thick would you say it was?
Well, listening to this book, I was like, she sounds like my grandma.
That's okay. Well, that's kind of fun. I'll have to listen to it so I can kind of get an idea.
It was just funny. Like, I mean, David, I played it for David a little bit because I was trying to explain to him how hard it was and like what I was struggling with. And he's like, well, they don't sound like they're from Mississippi. So obviously she didn't sound like my grandma, but it was like, was just
Just the thick
similar. Yeah.
Southern accent. That's so
And they talk,
fun.
they speak, it's almost like when they speak a different language almost,
Mhm.
because they use terms that we don't use. Like David would say, they would say like, I cut it half in two. Stuff like that. Like here on the West Coast, we say, I cut it in half.
Yeah, because that's what makes sense.
Right. And so
I
like,
cut it half in two.
yep, I cut it half in two. And
Oh,
anyways, so just little things like that. I felt like there was a lot of that in this
yeah.
book where I
Yeah.
was like, I don't know what they're talking about. So it kind of took a little bit of
Yeah. Kind of get
work.
hung up on those things to like translate what the heck they're saying.
Yeah. So I would like to
Cool.
listen to it again.
Yeah.
Maybe. So I liked it. I ended up liking it,
Mhm.
but it took a little bit of work to get into the flow.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
okay.
Cool.
What are you reading?
Okay, so a few days ago I finished this one. So one of the things I wanted to do this year with my reading was to try some things that I don't usually gravitate towards, and psychological thrillers fall into that category. Like I just don't. So this one's probably a pretty mild one, but it's called Never Lie by Frida McFadden. Honestly, I hadn't heard of it before. I didn't know anything about it. I did read the, description and stuff before, but it's just one that came up on Hoopla and I was like, all right, let's try this. This is not what I usually do. But it had really good like reviews and everything for the most part, I think. Anyways, Never Lie by Frida McFadden. And I don't know if I really want to talk about it very much either, because I feel like I would give away a lot, but it's told from two different points of view. It's a psychiatrist and a girl she and her husband are thinking about moving into the psychiatrist's house because the psychiatrist, something that you know from the very beginning of the book, the psychiatrist is very successful, very wealthy, has this huge house out in the country, out on the East Coast. And she has been killed. And everybody thinks that her boyfriend is the one who did it. And so this woman and her husband are thinking about buying this house, but it's kind of like creepy to them. They get stuck out in the house because there's been this huge snowfall and everything. And so there's just this huge process of discovery by everybody, including the reader. And you're like, huh, interesting. So
Did you like it?
I did. Yeah. I think there was a little bit of language. There was. And there were, anyways, but not horrible. There was only a couple of places that were like, wait, what? Because most of the time there's like no language and at all. And so I think like way later on in the book, there's a couple of words that I was like, holy cow, there was nothing until now. So yeah, then that happened.
That always surprises you. You're like,
Yeah.
oh.
Yeah, because a lot of times if a book is going to have language, it like starts out that way. So you can like make your decision right then if you want to continue or not. But this one, you're like 3/4 of the way through the book. And you're like, anyways. So
That's okay. Awesome. I don't read much in the vein of thrillers either.
Yeah. I've never done a Stephen King, and I think that he would probably be considered a psychological thriller, wouldn't he?
Or horror.
Or would it be horror?
Might be horror. I'm trying to think, what was the big one I read was The Silent Patient. I think that's a psychological. Maybe that's not, I don't know. I think that's a psychological thriller.
Okay.
Who's that by? That was a big one a few years ago. And it was interesting, had a big twist by Alex Michael Leeds, I think. I don't know. Anyways, that was a good one.
Yeah.
I love them because they're page turners.
Yeah. Yeah. Makes you want to keep listening and keeps you awake when you're like,
yeah, exactly.
So
next week we're going to do chapters. We're going to start book 2 and
it starts over with chapter 1. So that's
confusing.
Yes. So it'll be book 2, and maybe that's just how we'll need to label the videos as well. It's
Yeah.
just book 2, chapters 1 through 8.
So yeah, next week we will do A Tale of Two Cities, book 2, chapters 1 through 8.
Yes.
That'll be fun. And that will, this is going to be a long one, just like the Far from the Madding Crowd. But that's okay.
Lots
It's
of good stuff.
complicated. Well, I'm telling you, when I read the plot at the beginning, I was like, oh no. There's a lot of people.
There's a lot to it.
A lot of things going on. And then I'm like, we handle Far from the Madding Crowd. And there was a lot going on in that. So
Yeah, for sure. We can totally do this. And I think we just need to focus on, like, in the beginning of each episode, we do a quick recap of what we talked about before,
Yes.
and like a reminder of characters and stuff. I think that'd
Okay.
be really helpful. So,
okay, we got your back.
just like Dickens did, since he
Right.
would do that little subtle reminders in each installment. So,
Yes, totally. We're so happy you joined us for this episode. We hope you will join us next week as we discuss A Tale of Two Cities, Book 2, chapters 1 through 8. If you have suggestions for books we should read and discuss, please email us at thebestbookspodcast@gmail.com. We would love it if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts and share our podcast with your friends. We want to inspire and encourage as many people as we can to read out of the best books.
as Thoreau says, read the best books first, or you may not have a chance to read them at all. See you next week.